She works in a hospital basement sorting files, my mother said, laughing lightly as she refilled my brother-in-law's wine glass. We don't really talk about it at dinner parties. I was standing right there, 6 feet away, holding a casserole dish with both hands, because the counter was full of canapé trays my sister had ordered from a caterer in Oakville. I'm a medical records technician at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. I've done it for 11 years. I know every privacy regulation in the province of Ontario. I've helped coordinate 3 major system migrations, and I make a decent living. Not glamorous, not a conversation starter at dinner parties apparently, but decent. My husband Cormac works fleet maintenance for the city of Hamilton. He fixes the trucks that plow the roads in February, so people like my brother-in-law don't slide into a ditch on the 403. My mother set down the wine bottle and didn't look at me. I set down the casserole dish and went to find my coat. That was the night I finally understood something I'd been refusing to understand for about 15 years. I was never going to be the right kind of daughter. And my sister's engagement party, held in our mother's renovated Victorian in Dundas, paid for with money I still don't fully understand the origin of, was just the occasion where that fact finally said itself out loud. My sister Petra had been dating Aldous for about 8 months when he proposed. He was 41, she was 33, and he had a family name that got mentioned in the Financial Post. Old money, new ventures, a condo in the annex, and a property up near Muskoka. My mother had liked him from the first handshake. I could tell by the way she changed when he was around. Softer, more deliberate with her words, laughing at things that weren't quite funny. Cormac and I had been married for 7 years by then. We had a semi-detached on Garth Street, a rescue greyhound named Patty, and a shared savings account that we were slowly, responsibly building toward a down payment on something a little bigger. We were fine. We were actually more than fine. We were happy in the way that people are happy when they've chosen the right person and made peace with modest things. But modest things did not impress my mother. She had grown up in Brantford, daughter of a man who drove a delivery truck and a woman who took in alterations. She never talked about that. By the time I was old enough to ask questions, she had rewritten her personal history into something that sounded vaguely like old Ontario WASP stock. Careful vowels, strong opinions about certain brands of furniture, a subscription to a magazine no one I knew had ever heard of. She wanted to arrive somewhere. She wanted her children to be the proof that she had. Petra understood that without being told. I never did. When Aldous announced the engagement at that dinner, he stood up, tapped his glass, gave a little speech that was polished enough to make me wonder if he'd done it before. My mother cried in the way she'd always wanted to cry at something like this. Happy tears, but performed. Wiped with the edge of a cloth napkin she'd borrowed from somewhere because her own were polyester. I hugged my sister. I meant it. Whatever I thought about the speed of it, whatever small private doubts I had about a man I'd met twice, Petra was my sister, and she was happy, and I hugged her and told her so. Cormac shook Aldous's hand and said, "Congratulations," and Aldous said, "Thanks, man," in a way that made it clear he'd already sorted the room into categories. We left before dessert. The drive home on the 403 was quiet, and Cormac kept his hand on my knee and didn't say anything about my mother's comment until I brought it up first, somewhere around the Centennial Parkway exit. "Did you hear what she said? About the hospital basement." "I heard," he said. She said it like I processed cadavers. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved. "You okay? Not are you hurt? Not that was awful. Just, you okay?" After 7 years I knew exactly what that meant. It meant he already had his arm around me even though both hands were on the wheel. "Not really," I said. "But I will be." I was wrong about the timeline on that. The wedding date was set for the following September, a Saturday, which in cottage country terms meant Aldous had either paid a premium or called in a favor, because September Saturdays in Muskoka were not easy to secure. The venue was a restored heritage property on an island accessible only by boat or float plane. My mother forwarded me the website link the morning after the engagement party with no message attached, just the link. I clicked through it at my desk at St. Joseph's, eating a granola bar, looking at photos of white linen and birch trees and a dock with fairy lights. It was genuinely beautiful. I saved one of the photos as my phone wallpaper for about a week before I felt strange about it and changed it back to a picture of Patty. For the next several months, the wedding was the organizing principle of my family's life. My mother and Petra spoke every day. There were trips to Toronto for dress fittings, consultations with a florist in Yorkville, a menu tasting that I was not invited to but heard about afterward in extensive detail. The wedding was growing the way things grow when someone with resources decides they want something to be memorable. Cormac and I were not consulted on any of it, which was fine. It wasn't our wedding. But we also weren't really included, which was different. I found out about the rehearsal dinner venue from my sister's Instagram. I found out that my mother had hired a day of coordinator when the coordinator emailed me. Apparently I was on some list somewhere, asking for my dietary restrictions. What I did not find out until much later was that my mother had been accessing my RRSP contributions. Let me explain how that happened, because it took me a long time to reconstruct the timeline, and I still find parts of it hard to look at directly. When I was 24, I was in a difficult stretch. Cormac and I weren't together yet. I was living in a basement apartment in Hamilton's North End, and I had just started at St. Joseph's on a contract that might or might not renew. My mother offered to help me set up my first registered retirement savings plan. She was good with paperwork. She'd always been meticulous about forms, and I was overwhelmed and grateful, and I signed what she put in front of me without reading it carefully enough. I trusted her. She was my mother. That sentence sounds unbelievably naive now, and I've turned it over enough times to know that being naive isn't the same as being stupid. It just means you haven't yet learned which specific lesson this particular person is going to teach you. What I eventually discovered is that she had set up the account in a way that gave her signing authority alongside me. Not full control, not enough that any singles institution would have flagged it, but enough. Over the years, she had made small withdrawals. Never enough at once to trigger a notification I'd notice, always with some explanation ready if I'd thought to ask. A transfer here, a reallocation there. I hadn't been paying close enough attention. I was building my career, then my marriage, then my actual financial literacy. The kind you develop in your mid-30s when you finally sit down with a proper fee-only financial planner at a credit union on Concession Street and let someone walk you through the whole picture. That appointment was in February, the winter before the wedding. The planner, I'll call her the planner, she became important, spread everything out in front of me, and went line by line, and when she got to the RRSP, she asked me a question I didn't immediately understand. Who's the other authorized party on this account? I thought she was confused. There isn't one. It's just mine. She turned the screen toward me and pointed. I read my mother's name. I didn't say anything for a moment. The office had one of those small white noise machines outside the door, and I became very aware of the sound of it. How long has this been the case? I asked. She told me what the records showed. She asked if I'd authorized it. I signed something when I was 24, I said. I didn't understand what I was signing. We went through the transaction history together. The withdrawals were small and scattered. Looking at them one by one, any single one could have been explained. Looking at them all together, across 11 years, they added up to just over $19,000. I drove home from that appointment and sat in my car in the driveway on Garth Street for a while before going inside. Patty pressed her long gray nose against the front window and looked at me. I watched her look at me. When Cormac got home from the yard that evening, I was at the kitchen table with the planner's summary printout and a cup of tea I hadn't drunk. I told him everything. He sat down. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at the numbers for a long time. What do you want to do? He said finally. I don't know yet. Okay, he said. We don't have to decide tonight. We did not decide that night. I let the information sit in me for 2 weeks. I went to work. I processed files. I came home. I took Patty on her long evening walk along the trail by the escarpment, and I let myself think without forcing myself toward a conclusion. The conclusion came on its own, which is usually how the real ones do. I called a lawyer, a woman who had been recommended to me by a colleague who'd gone through a trust dispute with their own family, and I made an appointment. I didn't tell my mother I was doing this. I didn't tell Pestra either. I went on a Tuesday afternoon, used a personal day, and sat in a quiet office on King Street East and laid out the full picture. The lawyer asked very clear questions, and I gave very clear answers. At the end of the appointment, she told me that what had happened was not ambiguous and that I had options. She also told me that whatever I decided, I should get myself removed from that account structure immediately, which I did the following week. I did not yet tell my mother that I knew. I kept this private because I needed to understand the full shape of it before I did anything. And because, this is the part that's hardest to say simply, I was still hoping there was an explanation I hadn't thought of. That's not weakness, or at least I've stopped calling it that. That's just what it looks like when you love someone who has been disappointing you for a very long time, and you're still, somehow, not quite finished hoping. The wedding was 8 weeks away. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening to discuss what I was wearing, not to ask. To discuss, which in her usage meant to inform and then take questions. Petra's bridesmaids are in dusty sage, she said. The family guests should do something neutral. Cream or champagne, nothing that competes. I told her I had a dress I thought would work. I'd like to see it before you commit, she said. I'm 38 years old, I said pleasantly. I'll send you a photo. There was a pause. Cormac knows what to wear to something like this, yes? He's worn a suit before, Mum. I'm just making sure. Aldous's family will be there, and his firm's partners, and there are going to be people from. She listed some names. Some were familiar, the kind of names that show up in local news and charity galas. I just want it to go smoothly. It'll go smoothly, I said. She paused again, And then she said something that I have replayed many times since, in the way you replay things that you almost missed the significance of. You know, Leanna, I've been thinking. With the venue, the access is by water taxi from the Gravenhurst dock. There are really only so many seats, and the coordinator is already managing a very tight guest count. Aldous's side is quite large. I wonder if it might actually be easier for everyone if you and Cormac celebrated from home and we did a little dinner after, just family. I let the silence run for a moment. You're asking me not to come to my sister's wedding. I'm asking you to consider not to come to my sister's wedding. Leanna, I'm just thinking practically. Okay, I said. Let me call you back. I hung up the phone and I sat down on the couch and Patty climbed up beside me, which she is technically not supposed to do, and I let her. I called Petra. She didn't answer. I left a message. She texted back 40 minutes later. Sorry, in a fitting. Everything okay? I wrote back, call me when you can. Important. She didn't call that night. The next morning my mother called and said she'd spoken to Petra, and that Petra thought it was for the best, and that they would of course love to have us for dinner the Sunday after the wedding. And wasn't that lovely? We could look at photos and hear all about it. I sat with the phone against my ear and the sound of the hospital building around me, trolleys in the corridor, someone's radio down the hall, the normal sounds of a working morning, and I said, I understand. I'll be in touch. I called Cormac. He listened to the whole thing. Then he said, we're not going to the Sunday dinner either. No, I said, we're not. I called my lawyer that afternoon. What happened next took several weeks to unfold, and I want to be careful about how I describe it because the point of it wasn't drama. The point of it was accuracy. My lawyer had already begun a process to recover the funds that had been taken from my account. That process required documentation, and that documentation required some investigation, and the investigation surfaced things that were not just about me. My mother had refinanced her Dundas home twice in 4 years. The second refinancing had been at a private lending rate that was significantly higher than anything a chartered bank would offer, which usually means one of two things. The borrower cannot qualify conventionally, or they needed the money quickly and quietly. In this case, it appeared to be both. More relevantly, there were some questions about a joint account my mother had co-managed with my grandmother before my grandmother's death 3 years prior. My grandmother had been sharp until almost the end, but there was a period of about 8 months where her affairs had been managed primarily by my mother on her behalf. My lawyer, reviewing the broader picture with me, suggested we loop in a specific professional. The professional in question was a forensic accountant. She was quiet and thorough and asked for several months of financial records, which my lawyer helped me compile. I did not attend my sister's wedding. Cormac and I drove up to Tobermory that weekend instead, a thing we had talked about doing for years and never prioritized. We stayed at a small inn, walked the Cypress Lake trails, took the glass-bottom boat tour out to Flowerpot Island. It was cold the way Georgian Bay is cold even in September, that particular Canadian cold that feels clean. Cormac found a bookshop in town and spent an hour inside while I sat on a dock and watched the water. I don't want to romanticize it too much. I cried twice that weekend. Once in the car on the Friday night drive up, somewhere past Barrie. Once on the Saturday morning, when Petra sent a photo of herself at the altar. She must have had someone send it to me, or maybe she sent it herself, and she looked genuinely beautiful and genuinely happy, and I felt the specific grief of loving someone and being unable to be there. But I also felt, for the first time in a long time, the strange lightness of not pretending, not dressing up and performing calm, not standing in my mother's renovated Victorian holding a casserole dish while she talked about hospital basements, just being exactly where I was and who I was, with the person who actually knew me. You doing okay? Cormac said when I came back from the dock. Yeah, I said. Actually, yeah. The wedding was on a Saturday. The following Tuesday, my lawyer received a call. The forensic accountant's work had flagged a pattern that, in her professional judgment, warranted referral. She had filed a report with the relevant provincial authority. In Ontario, the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee deals with certain categories of financial exploitation, and depending on the specifics, matters can escalate. My grandmother's estate had irregularities significant enough to cross that threshold. I did not know until my lawyer told me that Aldous's family, specifically a family trust connected to his uncle, had a pre-existing professional relationship with the firm that held my grandmother's investment accounts. When the forensic accountant's report circulated to the appropriate parties, someone in that network recognized the account names. And then, apparently, someone made a call. I wasn't there for what happened at the wedding itself. I only know what Petra told me later, after enough time had passed that she could talk about it without the defensive anger. What I know is that during the reception, 3 individuals arrived at the island venue by boat. They were not guests. They spoke with Aldous's uncle privately. Aldous was brought into the conversation. My mother, who had been having what by all accounts was an excellent time, was asked to step into a quiet room with a view of the lake. Petra said she thought at first it was some kind of toast, that someone was organizing a surprise. She'd had a glass and a half of sparkling wine, and she was on her wedding day, and she wasn't primed for this particular shape of event. The conversation my mother had in that room I can only know secondhand. But the outcome was not ambiguous. The irregularities in my grandmother's estate created legal exposure that directly involved my mother. The house in Dundas, refinanced twice, at high private rates, to fund what it was now becoming clear had been a sustained lifestyle of spending beyond her actual means, had liens being assessed. The financial structure she had built to appear stable was, in fact, load-bearing on money that was not hers to use. None of this could be fixed at a wedding reception. None of it could be fixed with a phone call. But it was, in its own way, the first moment all of it became real in a room with other people present. My mother called me the following Monday. I let it go to voicemail. She called again Tuesday. I listened to the Tuesday message. She was asking me to explain to her what was happening. She sounded smaller than I'd heard her sound before. Not sorry exactly, my mother has never been naturally fluent in sorry, but uncertain, off-footing. I called my lawyer instead of calling her back. Then I called Petra. That call was hard. Petra was trying to process the fact that her honeymoon had begun with a legal conversation and that the week she'd imagined, beautiful and celebratory, and finally arriving at something she'd been reaching toward, had been quietly complicated by the thing she didn't know was coming. She was also trying to process the fact that she hadn't known, that nobody had told her, that she had unknowingly been part of a social performance that was built, in part, on a foundation of money that was owed elsewhere. I was honest with her. I told her I'd known for months. I told her why I'd waited. I told her I was sorry she'd had to find out that way and that I'd had no control over the timing of it. She was quiet for a long time. Did you know they were going to come to the wedding, she said. No, I said. And that was true. I hadn't known the timing. I hadn't orchestrated the arrival of those individuals at the reception. That had come out of a professional process that had its own logic and its own timeline and its own reporting obligations. Okay, she said. Are you okay? I'm going to be, she said. Aldous is. He's actually being really solid about it. His family's handling their side of it. I'm glad, I said. And I meant that too. Things after that took a long time to settle. Legal things don't resolve on emotional timelines, and I had to learn that, keep relearning it, every time I felt impatient. The matter of my grandmother's estate moved slowly through the appropriate channels. The matter of my own account was more straightforward, and my lawyer moved it toward resolution over the following several months. I was not made whole in every sense. There are costs to these things that don't show up in a financial summary, but the amount that had been taken from my RRSP over 11 years was recovered, with interest, before the following spring. My mother did not lose her house immediately. That process also took longer than the dramatic version would suggest, but the house was eventually sold, the liens made it essentially unavoidable, and she moved into a rental apartment in Burlington. I helped her move 2 boxes. Cormac carried the heavier furniture. I did not help her reframe the story of what had happened, though she tried several versions of it over the following year, and I sat through them without confirming any of them. Petra and Aldous came to our place for dinner in November, just the 4 of us, with Patty underfoot and a pot of split pea soup on the stove because the weather had turned cold and I didn't feel like doing anything ambitious. We talked about their trip. They'd done Iceland, which Petra showed us photos of on her phone, and about Cormac's work, and about a course I was starting to think about taking to move into health information management, which would be a step up. We didn't talk about my mother much that night. We'd talked about her in separate conversations already, more than enough to establish the outline of where each of us stood. At the end of the night, when they were getting their coats at the door, Petra held on to me for an extra moment. I'm sorry I didn't call you back that night, she said. The night you called about coming to the wedding. I know, I said. I should have. Yeah, I said, but I understand how it happened. She pulled back and looked at me. Are we okay? I thought about it honestly. Not the polished answer, the real one. We're getting there, I said. She nodded. That was enough for now. Cormac walked them out to their car, and I started running water for the dishes. Patty came and stood near the kitchen doorway and watched me with her serious greyhound expression, the one that always looks like she has a considered opinion she's choosing not to share. The water was warm. The house was quiet in the particular way it gets quiet after people leave. Fuller than regular silence, still carrying the shape of the evening. I thought about my grandmother, whose money had been meant for different things. I thought about the February appointment at the credit union, the planner's careful hands spreading papers across the desk, the white noise machine outside the door. I thought about a dock in Tobermory with cold Georgian Bay water underneath it, and sitting there not performing anything for anyone, and it being enough. It was enough.